You asked, I deliver. Hello and welcome back to Jenna Gets Creative. I got a few questions on my Facebook page recently about mixing and using Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay India inks as a follow-up to my review of those inks in a video last year. Shout out to Angie for asking. So today I'm going to remake my mixing chart with these inks, explain what I'm doing, and give some tips. Anybody who's asked to see my mixing chart up until now saw a crappy cell phone photo of this chart, and I guessed that when I made the mixing chart, I did my mixing directly on the paper because that's how I used to do it. Mixing squares on the top/right of the diagonal were mixed with the top color laid down first, and the reverse is true on the bottom/left side. This time I'm actually going to do my newer method, which I like better, and that's to mix the colors on a palette type surface and swatch both the 1-to-1 mixed color and a water diluted version. So first things first, this is the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay India inks set number 1 without the built-in droppers. There are 12 inks in this set, 2 of which are black and white, and I will not be including those in the main mixing chart. If this were set number 2, which is 12 additional colors, my mixing chart would be a 12x12 grid instead of 10x10. I've labeled the colors in the same order from left to right across the top and from top to bottom down the left-hand side. The squares on the top left to bottom right diagonal in the grid will all just be the pure color, as that's where the colors match up with themselves on the horizontal and vertical axes. So I just go ahead and swatch the unmixed, undiluted inks there. I swatched in my version of rainbow color order for this set, treating the bright red as a orange and following it with magenta, and then slotted brown in at the very end. You can certainly put your chart in whichever order you wish, and you can do the white and black inks as well if you want. I will be doing some mixing with those in the second part, so stay tuned for that, and I'll talk about why I'm not including them in the chart at that point. So red is my first color on my chart. I'm going to do all of the red mixes first. I tried my best to use as close to the same amount of ink for each pair of colors I'm mixing as possible so that it's clear which of the two colors overpowers the other if they don't mix super evenly. I find violet and brown in this set are quite the little bullies in terms of overpowering the color they're mixed with. Every violet blend looks like a shade of purple, and only the greens and blue make the brown look like anything other than a warm shade of brown. For my diluted swatches, I dropped 2 drops of water into each blend on the palettes using my brush for roughly the same dilution power every time. Don't worry about not having a diluted swatch of the single colors, we'll also address that in part 2. Keep in mind when you're doing this sort of mixing chart and using it for your reference, this is just a starting point. This is equal ratio 2 color blends only. You can always try adding more of one color than the other for different effects, or blend more than 2 colors for even more new colors. Some of the blends with yellow and many of the blends with brown start to look like skin tone options, but adding a third color would perfect them. Dilute your blue-teal mix until you have a nice cyan, and that can add nicely to warm yellow-ochre range yellow and brown mixes for light to medium skin tones, for example. Also remember basic color theory from the color wheel. Colors directly across from one another on the color wheel are known as complements. Mixing these colors evenly will tend toward a brown shade, but giving just a little of one to the other will actually darken it without muddying it. A little red added to a green produces a darker green, and a little green added to a red produces a darker red. While you watch me complete the rest of my mix chart, before we move on to part 2, I'd like to run through my list of related talking points I brainstormed. First, let's talk about the inks themselves. These are, as the bottles say, pigmented India inks. This means the color comes from solid pigments, usually in a fine powder form, rather than a liquid dye. The benefit is the high degree of light fastness. The drawback is that the pigment separates and sinks to the bottom faster than a dye-based ink. Don't worry too much about this, it doesn't affect the color of the ink from use to use or anything like that, but you're pretty much guaranteed to find yourself needing to shake up the bottles of ink before use many times before the bottles are used up. These inks do claim to be waterproof once dry, so keep that in mind when working on mixed media pieces. These aren't watercolor, they won't reactivate or lift like watercolor, and they're not going to blend on the page after starting to dry like watercolor can. Light fastness is why I picked the Bombay India inks over the Hydrus watercolors, by the way, or any other popular competing brand's liquid watercolors. Liquid watercolors tend to be dye-based, which also tends to mean not light fast. I also wanted to mention that when I received these inks, they were frozen, and they're perfectly fine. I ordered them through Amazon. They were delivered at a time when we still had snow on the ground up here in Newfoundland. They waited overnight in the big metal cubbyhole community mailbox on the side of the road, so yeah, they froze. Just like paint, ink can freeze and thaw and be fine. Fortunately, there's enough space left in fresh, full bottles that expansion due to being frozen didn't burst the bottles at all. I have no idea if the opposite situation would be true, if they would be fine after being way too hot. This set without the built-in droppers is in plastic bottles, so I imagine if they didn't get hot enough to melt the bottles, they'd probably also be fine as long as they were sealed at the time so you could be sure that they didn't lose any non-pigment liquid content. Now let's talk about paper for a minute. When you're using ink for illustration and painting purposes, you're going to want to limit your paper choices a little more than if you were using the ink with a dip or fountain pen for calligraphy or hand lettering. When you're simply writing, almost any paper is going to stand up to the ink. When you're painting with the ink, you need a paper that can handle wet media. Lots of people seem to like smooth papers like Bristol for ink of all types, but I find Bristol tends to buckle and warp a little too much for my liking with wet techniques. I like to stick to watercolor paper or else the heaviest mixed media papers I can find. Most mixed media papers are cold press papers, but watercolor papers can be either cold or hot press, and some mills even produce other options. Cold press papers have a lot more texture to them. The tooth of the paper is quite pronounced as the paper fibers weren't thoroughly flattened during manufacturing. This is the most common type of watercolor paper you'll find, and the cheapest brands are pretty much exclusively offered as cold press. That's not a bad thing, just something to note depending on your personal preferences and what you're trying to achieve. Hot press papers flatten the paper's fiber a lot more, flattening the tooth into a much smoother surface. Some mills label paper as not press, and this is generally similar to the rougher cold press, though purely based on the fact that some companies offer both cold and not press in the same line, I have to assume there's something slightly different. Don't worry about it. Cold and not are rough, hot is smooth. Some companies will also offer a rough option which has even more tooth than cold press. Rougher papers like cold press are more absorbent, which means they will dry quicker, but also means your paint or ink is more likely to feather and not hold a crisp edge. This tends to be sturdier paper, which can handle more corrections, reworks, and lifting, and doesn't change too much in terms of dimension due to being thoroughly wetted. Colors dry less vibrant though, and the texture of the paper is always apparent. When working over top of your watercolor or ink in another medium, such as colored pencil, you're going to see the tooth of the paper in the pencil pigments unless you work hard at burnishing the tooth flat. I don't recommend blending pencil with OMS over top of another medium, as you never know what the OMS is going to do to the underlayers. Hot press paper, being smoother, is less absorbent. Watercolors and inks take longer to dry, giving you more time to work and allowing for different wet techniques that are more difficult on cold press. Colors dry much more vibrant. Crisp detail is more easily achieved. Too much water can result in warping of the paper that doesn't dry down in the same dimensions as before, and although straight lifting techniques are easy, serious reworking can quickly wear the paper down. Hot press is a better choice if you do a lot of work in pencil and don't want to see the texture of the paper underneath. Art papers are usually made of wood pulp, linen, or cotton, and watercolor paper specifically is almost always either wood pulp, cotton, or a blend of the two. The best material for watercolor paper is cotton. Cotton is very strong, naturally bright white, and naturally acid-free. If you want your art to last, then you need an acid-free paper, as this means the paper is less likely to break down or to encourage color shifting over time. Wood pulp, however, is cheaper, thus cheaper papers will be primarily or entirely made of wood pulp. For this reason, I recommend picking watercolor papers with the highest percentage of cotton fibers as you can afford, and look for papers that claim to be acid-free or pH neutral. My personal favorite paper is B Paper Company watercolor paper, which you can usually buy on Amazon in 50 or 100 sheet packs of pre-cut 6x9 sheets. This is 100% rag cotton, 140 pound or 300 GSM cold press watercolor paper. If you're looking for it right now, as this video is new, unfortunately that paper is out of stock in North America, but it should be back soon. I've ordered multiple packs over recent years and they remain my favorite. The paper I'm using for this mixing chart is Strathmore Vision watercolor paper, which is a student grade paper and probably largely made of wood pulp. It does claim to be acid free though, and it's also 140 pounds or 300 GSM in weight. This is a 9 by 12 inch pad and it's the second of 3 identical pads I own. I use this for swatch sheets in practice, not finished pieces. So far I've yet to find a sheet in any of these pads that's perfectly straight along all 4 edges, and I find the glue from the gummed edge doesn't come off the paper well. The first sheet will always have a good 1/4 of an inch of rough damaged paper where the excess glue was stuck down, but the remaining sheets underneath almost always have an uneven distribution of glue that simply doesn't want to let go. Alright, at this point I've finished the chart and started playing around with some of the other swatches and some blending practice. Let's talk about those other swatches I did on the side of the mixing chart. I did a dilution of all the single colors paired next to the color mixed with white. As you saw, mixing with white simply makes a pastel version of the color. I didn't include white in the mixing chart because that's all it would be, a row and a column of pastels. The major difference between adding white to a color rather than diluting it with water is that the white mix retains and sometimes even increases in opacity. Sometimes you're going to want an opaque color and that's fine. Sometimes you won't, so keep that in mind. As for black, I didn't add that to the mix chart for 2 reasons. First, in order to see the colors and not just a row and column of black, I would have to use much more of the color than the black, and I don't want to waste my inks. Second, it's bad form to darken with black unless you're trying to get a gray or a very dark color. Always try to darken with another color first, and remember that a little bit of a complementary color can darken very effectively. That said, I did swatch the black diluted into gray in order to see what this particular black looks like. It's close to neutral, but there's a bit of a blue hue to the watered down gray, which means this black will tend to result in cool tones when mixed, and will mix best with cool colors. I did also mix one specific color with black, and that was Payne's Gray, a nice blue dark gray. That's one of the convenience colors I always make sure I figure out how to mix if the set doesn't already have it. Hopefully my playing around with different wet and dry techniques on the separate sheet is mostly self-explanatory. I wanted to mention that the white ink is fairly opaque when painted over previously dried colors, as long as you apply it thick enough. But if you work it over dried ink, it does actually start to pick up the color underneath it. I've also noticed Winsor & Newton's white ink does this as well, but that's another good thing to keep in mind. If you want the white to stay white, don't work it over top of another color too much. Thank you so much for watching and for asking questions. Feel free to ask more questions in the comments down below. If you're looking for more to watch, I've got some suggestions up on the left side of the screen now. I upload art content twice a week at minimum, every Tuesday and Thursday, and if you like living life creatively, whatever that means to you, I'd love to have you along for the ride. Bye guys!